Coming up next on the Union Label will be a conversation with Hardy Williams, veteran area trade unionist and machinist union member. Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. When did you first sign a union card?
In August of 1964 with Local 123 at the Illinois Central Railroad shops.
And back then the shops were a going industry, weren't they?
It was a wonderful place to work. It was one of the better paying jobs in the area, benefits and wages. Mm-hmm.
And at that time, you all were repairing and rebuilding locomotives for railroads all over the country.
I was in some of the first ones that were hard when they switched over to diesel, and they were just getting rid of all the steam engines, and when they first started rebuilding the first diesels that they had worn out, that was what we were doing. Mm-hmm. And it was enjoyable work, something different every day. You know, it was a wonderful place to work.
Mm-hmm. You, of course, wound up working at B.F. Goodrich in Calvert City, which
Right.
is also a machinist local.
Right.
And I guess, so you've been actually in both branches of the machinist, the transportation part as well as the industrial part.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's things are done a little bit different in the transportation industry. It's such a large industry that they do like group bargaining. In other words, they do most of the negotiations for all the different railroads and the airlines and that sort of thing. A good friend of mine, Bob Reynolds, who you said you recently talked to,
Mm-hmm.
he was in that area. He was working there as an apprentice when I was. And then he went up the transportation side and got about as high as you could go without being a general vice president. The industrial side works a little different. It's more localized. You do individual plants and individual negotiations with the various plants, and not very much negotiating for large groups. I served in various positions in the local, from Stewart on up to different, well, just all kinds of offices in there. Ended up my last 10 or 11 years I was president of the district, and which was at that time 13 or 14 locals throughout the area, and I really enjoyed it. I had a good career working with the Machinist Union and for the Machinist Union.
And it's a very diverse union. I mean, you have airline mechanics, people who work in the railroads, actually automobile mechanics too, or some. Mm-hmm. William Wimpesinger, the famous president of the Machinists, mm-hmm. was an automobile mechanic in Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And then you've got the industrial aspect, which is at the plants at Calvert mm-hmm. City. That's a pretty diverse.
Well, if you go on with that, we had it at one time when I was first elected district president. We had the Lourdes Hospital. We had hospital mm-hmm. workers. We've got workers in just about every field mm-hmm. That you can think of. And I would like to think it's because the Machinist Union represents them well, represents all their people well, and other people look to them for representation.
Mm-hmm. Did you go through an apprenticeship program with the Machinists?
Yes, I did.
And how does that work?
Well, it was through the railroad, and at that time it was a 4-year program, and I liked about 2 months receiving my machinist master machinist, I guess what it was, ranking. But I think Bob and I and probably 7 or 8 more were the first apprentices that were ever raised up to the machinist level with 2 years of the program in. They promoted us while we were in the apprentice program, still in the apprentice program, and we were actually doing machinist work without supervision, you know, mm-hmm. for the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. And it's a very varied program. At that time, you had to be able to weld with both electric welding, heliarc, torch welding, brazing, that sort of thing. You had to be able to do machine work to very small tolerances, and just about in general mechanic work. You know, they did it all. You did it all. When you come up through that apprentice program, you could do about anything they had to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing that's always fascinated me about the Machinists is that it is both a skilled trades union as well as an industrial union. Mm-hmm. And that sort of makes it unique. You know, you think of the old industrial unions like the steel workers and the old rubber workers and the auto workers. Then you think of the old craft unions like carpenters and plumbers and things like that. And the Machinists always seem to have like one foot in each camp.
That's true. While at the railroad, you know, they had the various unions. They had all the construction unions in there too. They had the electricians, pipe fitters, sheet metal workers, boiler makers, all the different trade. They even had blacksmiths. And at that time, they had a foundry there. They brought in raw steel, melted the steel, made the frames, the boilers, the whole kit and caboodle on a steam engine. Every piece of that steam engine was made right here in Paducah, Kentucky.
Wow.
You know, and as the locomotives came in, the diesel locomotives came in, well, they moved away from that, you know, to where it was more mechanic type jobs than it was machine jobs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can still remember as a kid coming over to shop at Sears across the street and seeing those old steam engines in the back that were being scrapped out down through the years. And then the transition was the old diesel locomotives, the Illinois Central passenger diesel locomotives. And I mean, that was the real heyday of the railroad. I had a roundhouse out there.
Right. It was still there and still being used when I went to work there. It was scrapped shortly, I'd say in '65, somewhere along in there they finally scrapped that out because the diesels could go either direction a lot easier than the steam locomotives could, so it wasn't as necessary to be turning them around and fool with them all the time.
Right.
So it was the community where I grew up. There wasn't a lot of professional people, and the people that I saw in the community from day to day worked either at Calvert City or at the railroad shops or at what was Union Carbide at that time. That we called it the atomic plant.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got out of school, I should have went to college, but I didn't. That wasn't what interested me at that time. I wanted to go to work and make some money. Mm-hmm. And so I tried to get a job at where I thought was the best opportunities, and that was the railroad shops at that time.
Where'd you
and
go
I
to
was
high
lucky
school?
enough at Simpsonia High School.
Yeah.
Graduated from Simpsonia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All 12 years there.
And that's the thing about when the industries came into Western Kentucky. Before that, I think we all had relatives who went to Detroit to work or Cleveland to work or wherever. And these good-paying union jobs, that enabled a lot of Western Kentuckians to stay here and work.
That's right. My brother graduated in '53, I think, and he left shortly thereafter and went to Detroit and worked in a large stamping company, and then one of the automobile manufacturers in Detroit. And I guess probably don't want to get into politics and that, but as things do happen, there was a recession in the '50s during the Eisenhower administration, and he had to come back here and find a job. And he ended up working for Klausner's hosiery mill. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he was, I guess, what got me interested in the union, and he was president of the local of the old, I think, is Amalgamated Clothing Workers.
I think it was.
And he was president of that local, and I was exposed to a lot of that, and that influenced me a lot, seeing the working conditions and the things that they gained over some of the other places, other people that were working around there.
Mm-hmm. And then you went to work at Goodrich at Calvert. When did you do that?
That was in June of '68.
So you went from the railroad shops to Calvert.
Right. 1 week in
In 1
between.
week.
I was off 1 week and went between there.
Yeah. Now that's an industrial union, a completely
Yeah.
different operation.
It is.
Was it hard to adjust to that?
Well, when I was actually hired, I was hired as a machinist to do machine work. And between the time that they hired me, which was only a couple of days, they had to post that job, and they didn't think that any of their people were qualified. Well, they had one fellow that was qualified, Billy Culp, and when he bid on the job, they had to let him have it. So they offered me a chemical operator's job, which I was kind of like a lot of other people that were hard on there. Operator, I thought that meant running a bulldozer or a road grader or something like that. And
You're right.
I was standing around looking, looking for my piece of equipment to run, and they started telling me about all these valves and furnaces and all the things that I was going to be running, and I was kind of flabbergasted to tell the truth.
Well, it's funny that you'd mention that, and I'm like you, and I've heard that term, and that's obviously a pretty common job classification up there. And I thought, an operator, I think of operating engineers, you're right. And now those Calvert plants, of course, they're a lot more, I guess, mechanized than, say, General Tire, when there's a lot of physical labor involved. And at the Calvert plants, it's not as much as that?
It's not a, I guess what you call a labor-intensive job. It's an extremely stressful job because you're got to cover a wide area. And in my case, where I hard in was in the furnace area in the ethylene plant. You had 7 furnaces that have literally hundreds of valves and things that you have to operate and keep tuned, and a lot of pneumatic instruments and electronic instruments and things that you have to watch and constantly be monitoring to keep everything going right. The temperatures can't vary very much on the gas that's running through there in order to get the maximum product. When I first went to work there, we were struggling to get 100,000 pounds an hour through that plant. I think by the time I left, 25 or so years later, they were running like 1 million pounds an hour. It was just tremendous. And we would have shutdowns at least every 2 or 3 days. I mean, the thing would just kick off line, and you'd have to run like the dickens because they had us convinced that that thing would blow up. We thought it would, and it would have in certain situations. And we ran just as hard as we could run, and that's hard to imagine, the little fat boy that I am, but I wasn't always that size, and we did have to run, and we worked hard, and finally over a period of time with the engineers and everybody's help, the job got a lot easier because we would go months at the time without a shutdown, and it was a lot better.
What did that plant make?
It made various products, ethylene being one of the major products, and all kind of byproducts. You took propane and ran it through a furnace at around 2,000, 2,100 degrees. It separates into the various components, ethylene, propylene, acetylene, various things that come off of that. They separate them off into different streams with distillation columns, and then they use those products to make vinyl chloride, which is the end product for that plant, was the main product. We shipped out a lot of things out of there, but most of them were byproducts, but the main product was vinyl.
Now, at the plant at Calvert, your first office was steward?
Yes,
What makes a good union steward?
Being able to say no, I think. A lot of stewards think that, a lot of union people think that the steward's job is to defend the union member regardless of the situation. You have a certain responsibility to do that, but you have to be able to say, hey, you've got a gripe, this is not a grievance, and to try to maintain good relationship with the company and the people that you're working with, the union people that you're working with. But you have to be able to tell if something is contractual or if it's something that has been done as a past precedent, or a past practice. A lot of things like that are almost as good as contract, but not quite. But you have to be able to separate those, and everybody, no matter what his problem is, how trivial it may sound to you, you have to, and no matter how many times you've heard it, you have to listen to what that person is saying, and then advise him, look, we'll get a hearing on this, we'll go in here and talk about this, but this is really not something that we can take on through the grievance procedure. And a lot of people don't do that. I always tried my best to do that. Wasn't always successful. A lot of times it's so borderline, there's a lot of gray areas. and it's hard to do. But I prided myself on doing that, and I think that's what makes a good steward, being able to listen and decide and to know the contract.
And then what were the offices you held after that?
Well, I had safety offices and different. Offhand, I can't even think. I was always just about always a delegate to the area council. I was a delegate to the district from our local. I never was chief steward. I never was a president of the local and things like that. But I had various assistance positions and things like that, and did a lot of stuff.
The safety issue, and that's another thing that when you think of unions, you think of wages, wages, hours, and benefits. Unions are big advocates for safety, and especially in the chemical industry. When you mention vinyl chloride, that's nasty stuff.
Yeah, it and all the byproducts and the things you use to make that is all nasty stuff, and it's extremely volatile in all stages. We had a lot of benzene in the plant. We had C4s. You think about those as being explosive, but that's a byproduct off of those processes, and you end up with that C4 material in the bottom of some of those columns. You would sometimes, we had one fellow that they dumped some of that on the ground at that time, which is unheard of now. But for somehow, I don't know how it happened, but it got on the ground. A fellow walked through it, and the static electricity from his shoes, it just set it off, and it blew the soles off his shoes and burned his legs really bad. But you just don't think about stuff like that. When I first went to work there, just about anybody in that plant, you could, including myself, you could blindfold me and drive me anywhere in that plant, and I could tell you where we were by how it smelled, what you were smelling. You learned to detect all that stuff, and you knew how dangerous it was. Even at that time, we even made hydrogen cyanide, was a byproduct of another synthesis process that they had over there. And they had drills all the time where someone would go out and pretend like they'd been overcome by cyanide, and they had a procedure they had to go through, and you had just a very short amount of time to respond to that, because that's what they used in the gas chambers at that time. I mean, it's an extremely deadly substance, and there were a lot of things like that up there. But I will say this: that company stressed safety about as strong as anybody. If you about the only thing you could not get by. I've heard a lot of people say, well, I wouldn't do this or I wouldn't do that. You couldn't get by with refusing a job unless it was safety related. If it was safety related and you thought you were going to get hurt or hurt someone, you could stop whatever you were doing and you could get a hearing. Now, they didn't always agree that it was unsafe, but they would listen and evaluate stuff and see. It was a fairly safe place to work. That's not to say we didn't have people get hurt, but it was a fairly safe place to work.
Something we talked about before we went on to start the program was apathy among union members. Obviously, the union is responsible for your wages, your benefits, your hours, your vacation, your safety. But yet, when you have your monthly union meeting, few people show up. I was talking to Larry Cumbie, who worked at the General Tire plant in Mayfield. He was on recently, and he was telling me that at their last contract, that something like 40% of the people didn't even bother to vote on this contract. This is a problem with unions. Any ideas how to deal with that?
Well, there's a whole lot of apathy or reluctance to participate from the union body, and I would like to think that that's from because of the good job that the union officials and the international unions are doing negotiating the contracts. They have a lot of trust in the committees. The machinist union especially, the committees are elected, democratically elected. They have elections, and they elect people to those positions, and they may elect somebody to steward that may be a little bit hot-headed or whatever sometimes, but very seldom do you see those people end up on the negotiating committees. The people are very careful in who they they put in those positions, and I think they put a lot of trust in them, and then they don't support them by going back to the union meeting and voting on the contracts, but they should. The answer to that is education. The union doesn't make its case, I guess I'm trying to say, to the new workers as well as it should. A lot of the people that come in and they're glad to get those jobs, and they're high-paying jobs with good benefits, and they're really glad to get them. Well, they automatically give credit to that company, which a certain amount of the credit is due to them. They're furnishing the industry and the jobs and the things that make the money, but even a larger portion of that is the union's ability to get a part of those profits and those benefits for those workers. And sometimes those people forget that. Now, I have, during the recent discussion we've had about right to work and things like that, a fellow was talking to me and he said, well, I don't think I ought to have to belong to the union. And I said, well, you don't. You don't have to belong to the union. And if you don't want to belong, you shouldn't have to belong. And he said, well, I don't have any choice. I said, oh, you do. You don't have to go where they're paying good wages and got good benefits that the union has negotiated. You know, you don't have to work there. If you don't want to be a part of that, that's what got the wages and the benefits to where it was. There's not any companies, unless they're sitting alongside of a union company or between two union companies, that pay the same wages and benefits. The only reason they do it is to not have a union. And that being said, no union can organize a group of workers that are being treated right. If the company doesn't want a union, all they have to do is be fair and consistent and even-handed with the employees, and there's not a union anywhere that can organize it. I've seen it tried. You know, we've tried to organize some plants, and come to find out you had a few disgruntled employees, but the majority of them were extremely happy, you know. And it's very difficult to organize a group like that. There has to be some dissension or some problems or mistreating somebody.
You were also one of the local union leaders who, about 1975, decided to resurrect the old Labor Day parades, which go way, way back before the turn of the 20th century, continued up through World War II, and then for reasons that I've never been able to determine, just stopped. Who was in this group? You and who all did that?
Well, mainly the main person who got that back together and really resurrected that was Glenn Dowdy. And he spearheaded all that. He had the drive and the initiative to work through that and the time to work and get that back online. There were several people: Charlie Payton, Wendy Wallace, Harold Lovin, and his wife. There was just, I mean, it's hard to name all of them. There were so many, but they were all, just about all of the union leaders in this area were the ones. Harold Kindred, Aaron Edwards and his wife Bonnie was in that group. Sammy Henderson, who the council building's named after. There was just several of those people that were involved, and that's not at all a complete list. And I had a very small part in doing that. I was active, you know, in helping build some of the floats and the things like that. Before he's putting the organization back together, Glenn Dowdy did that almost single-handedly.
It's called the Western Kentucky Labor Day Committee Incorporated, all volunteer group. You're still involved in that,
right?
And
it's a nonprofit corporation, and it's nobody makes a cent. You know, is not paid expenses or anything out of it. It raises its own funds from volunteers and contributors, companies and unions alike, and a lot of individuals that contribute to it. We raise anywhere from 12, 15 to up to, I think one year we raised like $23,000 to put that on. But it's a 3-day affair now, and actually it's almost a 4-day because it actually starts on Friday. And starts getting things set up so that it's ready to open on Saturday morning. And it's a very, very labor intensive and very dedicated group that works on that. I wasn't very active this last year, and due to health problems and different things, I just wasn't wasn't very active in it, but they had a really successful program. We need more young people to get involved, and more people that are interested in the unions, knowing things to get involved in that. We could always use help. People say, well, in the past we didn't feel like we were needed. Well, you're needed now. We need all of you.
And that brings up another point, is most council delegates are at least middle-aged. I would imagine if you looked around local unions, most officers are at least middle-aged. That's another problem. How do you get young people involved in this, in their 20s?
Well, again, it goes back to education. A lot of the unions are beginning to really understand that, and they've started education programs within their locals and districts and various places. They're encouraging people to go to school, to attend out here, and make sure that they receive instructions from people who are teaching how unions work. The Machinists Union has a place in Maryland in Hollywood, Maryland, called Placid Harbor. It's called the Whippensinger Center. And it's
named for the international president, who,
yeah,
by the way,
right.
came here. I heard him over at Calvert City many years ago.
He was a character, a wonderful,
oh, he was.
wonderful speaker and motivator, and that it's really good that place is named for him, because it's something that he dreamed of and wanted done. I've been lucky. I met Mr. Whippensinger. I know the international president now, Tom Buffenbarger. He's a wonderful guy, and the fellow before him, and I'm sitting here trying to think of his name, trying to think of his name, but I've known the three international presidents that have been in office. I knew them and well enough to call them by their first names, and now I can't even think of that one. That's part of being, as you said, middle-aged.
Yeah,
but,
well, we're all that way. We're all middle-aged. We're all middle-aged.
But it's a very down-to-earth union. You can approach anybody in the union, from the international president on down. They're all very approachable. Warren Mart, who's the general secretary treasurer, he headed up part of this campaign, the strike campaign that we had at Lourdes. He's a very
He's from
unique
Henderson,
individual. Yes, he is. And he's a really nice guy. And most of the guys are just, like I said, they're people that worked up through the ranks. Of course, we have a lot of how you say this without sounding mean, but we have a lot of nepotism in there too. You have some sons, but they came from great bloodlines, and that kind of rose to the top. I don't think we have anybody that got his job just because he was somebody's son or daughter or son-in-law or something, that situation. But we have a lot of people who are really smart people, and they've encouraged their kids to go to college, be educated, and then come back and work for the union. And that's been extremely beneficial. That Placid Harbor, they teach. Those are really college level courses, and they insist on people participating. It's not a party. Is what I'm trying to say. When you go there, you're in school.
And we're glad you participated today, but they're telling we're out of time, so we've got to stop. And I'm Barry Craig. My guest today was Hardy Williams. We will see you next time.